'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in hopes that a brownie would soon be there. The red caps were nestled all snug in their beds, while visions of bloodletting danced in their heads. And Silky in her kerchief and I in my cap had just settled our affairs for a long winter's nap. When out on the parapets there arose such a clatter, I sprang from the bed to see what was the matter. Away to the windows I flew like a flash, tore open the shutters and threw up the sash. The moon on the breast of the new-fallen snow gave the lustre of midday to objects below, when what to my wondering eye should appear but a miniature sleigh loaded with 8 tiny slain deer. With a little old driver so lively and quick, I knew in a moment it must be old Pick. More rapid than eagles his hounds they came, and he whistled and shouted and called them by name. Now Shuck, now Padfoot, now Shug and Capelthwaite, on Cerberus, on Barguest, on Boggart and Bogey, to the top of the church, to the top of the wall, now dash away, dash away, dash away all. As dry leaves that before the wild hurricane fly, when they meet with an obstacle, mount to the sky. So up to the housetop the hounds they flew, with the sleigh full of body parts, and old Pick too. And then in a twinkling I heard on the roof the prancing and pawing and occasional woof. I drew in my head and was turning around. Down the chimney old Pick came with a bound. He was dressed all in rags from his head to his foot, and his clothes were all tarnished with ashes and soot. A bundle of bones he had flung on his back, and he looked just like a peddler just opening his pack. His eyes how they twinkled, his dimples how merry, his cheeks were like roses, his nose like a cherry. His droll little mouth was drawn up like a bow, and the beard of his chin was as white as the snow. The stump of a pipe he held tight in his teeth, and the smoke had encircled his head like a wreath. He had a broad face and a little round belly, that shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly. He was chubby and plump, a right evil old elf, and I screamed when I saw him in spite of myself. A wink of his eye and a twist of his head soon gave me to know that I had everything to dread. He spoke not a word but went straight to his work, and filled all the stockings, then turned with a jerk, and laying his finger aside his nose, and giving a nod, up the chimney he rose. He sprang to his sleigh, to his team gave a whistle, and the way they all flew like the down of a thistle. But I heard him exclaim before I succumbed to his bite, Happy Christmas to all, and to all a good night. Hello and welcome to this festive edition of Within the Boggart Wood. I hope none of you are expecting a normal rendition of 'Twas a Night Before Christmas, but I did find it interesting with how easy it was to change the course of an entire story with the substitution of just a few words and names. So as we come to the close of 2024, I would just like to thank everyone for their support. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to produce nearly as much content as I wanted to. Pesky real life keeps getting in the way, but I do hope you've enjoyed the somewhat smaller helping of Within the Boggart Wood this year. A couple of quick announcements. Going into the new year, I'm actually closing down the Patreon site due to a number of reasons discussed on Patreon itself. Going forward, if anyone does wish to support myself and the production of this podcast, I've set up a much more simple Buy Me a Coffee link, which you can find on the community page of the website. This allows for one-off donations, rather than folk feeling they have to join up with a monthly subscription. Secondly, again, see the community page of the website. I've set up a link to my Blue Sky social media profile. Again, as mentioned previously on other episodes, certain other platforms just aren't allowing group members to even see new posts, so I'll be moving away from them and concentrating on Blue Sky. I'm also being repeatedly asked to put episodes on YouTube, so fingers crossed over the Christmas break I'll get more put up. So without further ado, let's just crack on with the episode. In 1891, English writer Jerome K Jerome produced his book, Told After Supper. Jerome was an interesting fellow whose father had been an ironmonger and lay preacher with an interest in architecture. Jerome's plan had been to be a man of letters or politician, but his father's death had scuppered that plan, and instead he had to find work, ending up collecting fallen coals from wagons along the North Western Railway for a few years before turning his hand to stage acting. 3 years later he turned 21 and found himself still penniless and decided to change his fortune. He tried teaching, journalism, being a clerk to a solicitor, and also worked as a packer, all while writing plays. Finally in 1885 he had success with one of his plays. Then some of his essays, known for their humour, were published in the magazine Home Chimes. In 1888 he married Georgia Elizabeth Stanley Maris, only 9 days after she had divorced her first husband, which of course raised some Victorian eyebrows. Their honeymoon was a simple affair in a boat on the Thames, but inspired him to write 3 Men in a Boat, that book being published in 1889 to massive success. With the success came money, and Jerome was able to settle into the profession of satirical writer, writing books, plays and essays. As mentioned though, in 1891 he published Told After Supper, which was a collection of Christmas ghost stories. For those interested, I'll put a link in the episode description to a free download of the book. Here though, I'll read his introductory section to the book. It was Christmas Eve. I begin this way because it is the proper, orthodox, respectable way to begin, and I have been brought up in a proper, orthodox, respectable way, and taught to always do the proper, orthodox, respectable thing, and the habit clings to me. Of course, as a mere matter of information, it is quite unnecessary to mention the date at all. The experienced reader knows it was Christmas Eve without my telling him. It always is Christmas Eve in the ghost story. Christmas Eve is the ghosts' great gala night. On Christmas Eve they hold their annual fete. On Christmas Eve everybody in Ghostland who is anybody, or rather, speaking of ghosts, one should say, I suppose, every nobody who is any nobody comes out to show himself or herself, to see and be seen, to promenade about and display their winding sheets and grave clothes to each other, to criticise one another's style and sneer at one another's complexion. Christmas Eve parade, as I expect they themselves term it, is a function, doubtless eagerly prepared for and looked forward to throughout Ghostland, especially by the swagger set, such as the murdered barons, the crime-stained countesses, and the earls who came over with the Conqueror and assassinated their relatives and died raving mad. Hollow moans and fiendish grins are, one may be sure, energetically practised up. Blood-curdling shrieks and marrow-freezing gestures are probably rehearsed for the weeks beforehand. Rusty chains and gory daggers are overhauled and put into good working order, and sheets and shrouds, laid carefully by from the previous year's show, are taken down and shaken out, and mended and aired. Oh, it is a stirring night in Ghostland, the night of December the 24th. Ghosts never come out on Christmas night itself, you may have noticed. Christmas Eve, we suspect, has been too much for them. They are not used to the excitement. For about a week after Christmas Eve, the gentlemen ghosts, no doubt, feel as if they were all head and go about making solemn resolutions to themselves that they will stop in next Christmas Eve, while the lady spectres are contradictory and snappish and liable to burst into tears and leave the room hurriedly on being spoken to for no perceptible cause whatever. Ghosts with no position to maintain, mere middle-class ghosts, occasionally, I believe, do a little haunting on off nights, on All Hallows Eve and at Midsummer, and some will even run up for a mere local event to celebrate, for instance, the anniversary of the hanging of somebody's grandfather, or to prophesy a misfortune. He does love prophesying a misfortune, does the average British ghost. Send him out to prognosticate trouble to somebody and he is happy. Let him force his way into a peaceful home and turn the whole house upside down by foretelling a funeral, or predicting a bankruptcy, or hinting at a coming disgrace, or some other terrible disaster about which nobody in their senses would want to know sooner than they could possibly help, and the prior knowledge of which can serve no useful purpose whatsoever, and he feels that he is combining duty with pleasure. He would never forgive himself if anybody in his family had a trouble and he had not been there a couple of months beforehand doing silly tricks on the lawn or balancing himself on somebody's bed rail. Then there are, besides, the very young or very conscientious ghosts with a lost will or an undiscovered number weighing heavy on their minds who will haunt steadily all year round, and also the fussy ghost who is indignant at having been buried in the dustbin or in the village pond, and who never gives a parish a single night's quiet until somebody has paid for a first-class funeral for him. But these are the exceptions. As I have said, the average orthodox ghost does his one turn a year on Christmas Eve and is satisfied. Why on Christmas Eve of all nights in the year I never could myself understand. It is invariably one of the most dismal of nights to be out in. Cold, muddy and wet. and besides, at Christmas time, everybody has quite enough to put up with in the way of a house full of living relations, without wanting the ghost of any dead ones mooning about the place, I am sure. There must be something ghostly in the air at Christmas, something about the close, muggy atmosphere that draws up the ghosts, like the dampness of the summer rains brings out the frogs and snails. And not only do the ghosts themselves always walk on Christmas Eve, but live people always sit and talk about them on Christmas Eve. Whenever 5 or 6 English-speaking people meet round a fire on Christmas Eve, they start telling each other ghost stories. Nothing satisfies us on Christmas Eve but to hear each other tell authentic anecdotes about spectres. It is a genial festive season, and we love to muse upon graves, and dead bodies, and murders, and blood. There is a good deal of similarity about our ghostly experiences, but this of course is not our fault, but the fault of the ghosts, who never will try any new performances, but always will keep steadily to the old safe business. The consequence is that when you have been at one Christmas Eve party and heard 6 people relate their adventures with spirits, you do not require to hear any more ghost stories. To listen to any further ghost stories after that would be like sitting out 2 farcical comedies, or taking in 2 comic journals. The repetition would become wearisome. There is always the young man who was one year spending the Christmas at a country house, and on Christmas Eve they put him to sleep in the west wing. Then in the middle of the night the room door quietly opens and somebody, generally a lady in her nightdress, walks slowly in and comes and sits on the bed. The young man thinks it must be one of the visitors or some relative of the family, though he does not remember having previously seen her, who, unable to go to sleep and feeling lonesome all by herself, has come into his room for a chat. He has no idea it is a ghost, he is so unsuspicious. She does not speak, however, and when he looks again, she is gone. The young man relates the circumstance at the breakfast table next morning, and asks each of the ladies present if it were she who was his visitor. But they all assure him that it was not, and the host, who has grown deadly pale, begs him to say no more about the matter, which strikes the young man as a singularly strange request. After breakfast, the host takes the young man into a corner and explains to him that what he saw was the ghost of a lady who had been murdered in that very bed, or who had murdered somebody else there. It does not really matter which. You can be a ghost by murdering somebody else, or being murdered yourself, whichever you prefer. The murdered ghost is perhaps more popular, but on the other hand, you can frighten people better if you are the murdered one, because then you can show your wounds and do groans. Then there is the sceptical guest. It is always the guest who gets let in for this sort of thing, by the by. A ghost never thinks much of his own family. It is the guest he likes to haunt, who after listening to the host's ghost story on Christmas Eve, laughs at it, and says that he does not believe there are such things as ghosts at all, and that he will sleep in the haunted chamber that very night if they will let him. Everybody urges him not to be reckless, but he persists in his foolhardiness and goes up to the yellow chamber, or whatever colour the haunted room may be, with a light heart and a candle, and wishes them all a good night and shuts the door. Next morning he has got snow white hair. He does not tell anybody what he has seen, it is too awful. There is also the plucky guest, who sees a ghost and knows it is a ghost and watches it as it comes into the room and disappears through the wainscot, after which, as the ghost does not seem to be coming back, and there is nothing consequently to be gained by stopping awake, he goes to sleep. He does not mention having seen the ghost to anybody for fear of frightening them. Some people are so nervous about ghosts, but determines to wait till the next night and see if the apparition appears again. It does appear again, and this time he gets out of bed, dresses himself, does his hair, and follows it, and then discovers a secret passage leading from the bedroom down to the beer cellar, a passage which, no doubt, was not unfrequently made use of in the bad old days of yore. After him comes the young man who woke up with a strange sensation in the middle of the night, and found his rich bachelor uncle standing by his bedside. The rich uncle smiled a weird sort of smile and vanished. The young man immediately got up and looked at his watch. It had stopped at 4:30, he having forgotten to wind it. He made inquiries the next day and found that, strangely enough, his rich uncle, whose only nephew he was, had married a widow with 11 children at exactly 11:45, only 2 days ago. The young man does not attempt to explain the extraordinary circumstance. All he does is vouch for the truth of his narrative. And to mention another case, There is the gentleman who is returning home late at night from a Freemason's dinner, who, noticing the light issuing from the ruined abbey, creeps up and looks through the keyhole. He sees the ghost of a grey sister kissing the ghost of a brown monk, and is so expressibly shocked and frightened that he faints on the spot and is discovered there the next morning, lying in a heap against the door, still speechless, with his faithful latchkey clasped tightly in his hand. All these things happen on Christmas Eve. They are all told of on Christmas Eve. For ghost stories to be told on any other evening than the evening of the 24th of December would be impossible in English society, as at present regulated. Therefore, in introducing the sad but authentic ghost stories that follow hereafter, I feel it unnecessary to inform the student of Anglo-Saxon literature that the date on which they were told, and on which the incident took place, was Christmas Eve. Nevertheless, I do so. The following story is recounted from the Saturday 27th of December 1924 edition of the Cannock Chase Courier, entitled The Ghost of Beckenham Grange, a Christmas Ghost Story, by Julius F. Friend. It was Christmas Eve. The snow was falling softly and silently on the country village of Cowbury. The only noise audible to me as I strolled down the street, my coat collar tightly pulled round the loop of my scarf, my hands as far in my coat pockets as I could force them, was the distant voices of carol singers. The village, really nothing more than a street of scattered houses, boasted a general store, a butcher's, a baker's shop, the windows of which had been seasonably decorated for the occasion of Christmas. A low babbling of voices reached my muffled ears as I walked past the assemblage of shoppers and window gazers congregated at this little commercial centre. The termination of my walk was near at hand, and a few more yards brought me to the labour in vain, the village alehouse. The alehouse was a popular rendezvous of the village yokels, employed for the greater part on the neighbouring farms, and every evening there might be seen in the tap room in assembly over pint pots, discussing matters of local and topical interest. A Merry Christmas greeted two of the aggregates simultaneously as I entered. A Merry Christmas, everybody, I returned. And many on 'em, said one of the party, as I proceeded to divest myself of hat and coat. A bright fire was burning on the hearth. On looking round, I observed that a few sprigs of evergreen decorated the walls at intervals. The furniture consisted chiefly of a long deal table, apparently older than the landlord himself, a jovial, red-faced, corpulent man of 46, a long form, and a number of chairs of diverse patterns, on which were seated a variety of characters as diverse as the chairs themselves. It was a cold, frosty night, very seasonable weather for Christmas. Ordering a drink and a cigar from the landlord, I drew a chair up to the fire and sat gazing at the glowing flames. I was in a reflective mood, for it was the first Christmas I had spent in Cowbury, and many happy memories of past seasons came to my mind as I sat there revolving them. So deeply had I fallen into reflection in such a short time that I looked up suddenly, almost with a start, when I found myself being addressed. "Splendid weather for Christmas," said the landlord, placing my requisites beside me. "Splendid," I repeated. "Aye," remarked one who was apparently the most loquacious gentleman present, at the same time shaking his head as though actuated by some mechanical contrivance. "But it don't seem a bit like Christmas, though." "Does it not?" I retorted. "No, indeed it don't," he said. "Do it, Sam?" The interrogation was addressed to a man wearing corduroy trousers and jacket and a dilapidated bowler hat, sitting near to him. "No more it ain't, Joe," returned Sam. The loquacious gentleman addressed as Joe inclined his head toward me again. He regarded me for a moment in silence, and allowed himself time to light his pipe. As the match he held burned almost to its end, he threw it down sharply as it began to burn his fingers. "Do you know, sir," he said eventually, "there's one Christmas in Cowbury as I'll never forget. Perhaps you'd like to hear about it." Hoping to hear an interesting narrative, I told him I would be very pleased. "Well," he commenced, "it was like this. Just 20 years ago tonight, I sat in this same old alehouse, and as far as I remember, and I've got a good memory, the old place is much the same now as it was then, except for one face which I can picture now. I can see that face more plainly tonight than on any other night of the year, because today is the anniversary of its owner's birth," he lowered his voice, "and his death. Old Jimmy Gander," he continued, was one of the jolliest and best-hearted men I ever knew. The jokes he used to crack and the tales he used to tell kept us merry here on many an evening. On the night in question, the conversation drifted towards what is known as the ghost of Beckenham Grange. Beckenham Grange, as I suppose you know, lies about 2 miles from here on the church road. Some 20 years ago, the house was occupied by the Beckenhams, after whom the house is named. One Christmas morning, the family, with the exception of Sir Roger Beckenham, came down to breakfast at the usual time. It was customary for Sir Roger to be a little late. It was also customary for the rest of the household to wait for him before commencing breakfast. But on this morning he was rather later than usual, and it was suggested that he should be called. "I suppose he is extra tired after the party last night," said John, his eldest son. "I think we might break the rules for once and commence breakfast without disturbing him." It was resolved to carry out John's suggestion, and they proceeded to suit the action to the word, and commenced to partake of their Christmas breakfast. It was not until they were well advanced with the morning meal that Lady Beckenham ordered the servant to call the master of the house. Now, Sir Roger used to sleep in the room with the large balcony window facing east. It so happened that shortly after Mary, the servant girl, had left on her task, a shrill piercing shriek echoed and re-echoed through the house. Oh, such a shriek which naturally caused great consternation to everyone downstairs. Almost immediately, Mary dashed into the dining room in complete hysteria, her face, usually so ruddy, now as white as a dainty little apron she wore. "Sir Roger, madam," she stammered. "Whatever is the matter, Mary?" demanded the mistress impatiently, her face clearly expressive of terror at this sudden outcome. "Sir Roger, madam, he is dead." Having uttered these short, inarticulate sentences, Mary collapsed. Indistinct though they had been, every word had been heard, and the mistress rushed straight out of the room with the swiftness of a hare in chase, followed by John and his sister Eunice. An awful sight confronted the trio as they entered the room. Sir Roger Beckenham lay fully clothed on the bed, a large gaping wound in the throat, his eyes wide open and fixed as though concentrating on some hypnotizing object. The white countenance was stained with a large patch of red. He was stiff and cold. The blinds were still drawn, giving the room a somewhat sombre appearance. A razor lay with open blade upon the bed, scintillating like a lone star in the dark sky. The death of Sir Roger naturally cast a gloom over the rest of the family, and, as you may suppose, Christmas was not as merry as they perhaps anticipated. Anyhow, on the approach of the following Christmas, Lady Beckenham had become greatly consoled, and the tragic death of the head of the family had ceased to be so impressive in the minds of his widow and family. The room with the large balcony window facing east was now occupied by John, and as he went to bed he could not help, strong-willed as he was, reflecting upon the happenings of 12 months earlier. He went to bed, not to sleep, for he was overcome by a feeling of awe. He tried to dismiss the subject from his mind, but in vain. He lay and listened to the ticking of the clock. He watched every hour, heard it strike. 11 o'clock came and went, and John turned over in another attempt to sleep, but still in vain. 11:30. How slowly the time passed. At last, after what seemed like an eternity, the clock in the hall began to strike. 1, 2, 3. He knew it had commenced to strike 12, midnight. It was at this hour, and scarcely ere the clock had chimed its arrival, that a ray of light shining in through the window and falling across the centre of the room attracted his attention. As the clock chimed its final note, he clearly and distinctly heard a voice, the low and muttering, call him by name. "Who's there?" he shouted, gazing towards the door. No reply. He turned unconsciously again towards where the ray of light had been. But what was that? It was no longer a ray of light, for out of it arose, as he turned, a figure, an apparition. There it stood with an open razor clasped in the right hand and raised to the level of the shoulder. It was the ghost of his father. John lay still for a brief space of time, then suddenly dashed out of bed, out of the door, down the stairs, in less time than it takes to tell. At the bottom of the stairs he turned to see the cadaverous apparition posturing at the top. Old Joe made a pause, allowing himself to refill and relight his pipe, which he had been sucking at intervals by way of parenthesis while delivering his narrative. "Well," he continued, "there was a lot of talk about the Beckenham ghost, following the events which I have related, and 20 years ago tonight, we were discussing it here when suddenly old Jimmy Gander pipes in. "I don't believe there's no such thing as ghosts," he said. That started a great debate. One said as he believed strong as there was ghosts because his grandmother used to tell him as there was when he was a boy, and he wouldn't doubt anything that dear old soul told him. Another had heard as in remote times one used to walk in the castle grounds. Anyhow, as the Grange had now been vacated, a challenge was thrown out to any man in the room, insomuch as it was said that no man dare enter Beckenham Grange that night. "Who will wager on it?" says Jimmy. To be sure, he had many to wager with, and everything was fixed. It was arranged we should all accompany him to the Grange gates, and he was to enter the house at 5 minutes to 12, carrying a hammer and a nail. The nail was to be driven into the door of the bedroom with a large balcony window facing east, and he was to remain in the house until 5 minutes past 12. Well, we all left here at 11 o'clock and made our way towards the Grange. We took our time and arrived at the gates a quarter of an hour before midnight. At 5 minutes to 12, old Jimmy Gander went towards the house in the best of spirits. He had drunk pretty heavily, as we all had, and being Christmas Eve perhaps more than usual. But he was not drunk. No one ever remembered his having been drunk. At least, that was one of his favourite boasts. We watched him go inside, for it was a moonlit night, clear and frosty. Then we all waited for his return at 5 minutes past 12. 10 minutes was like half an hour. We kept our eyes on our watches until 5 minutes past 12. The time came, and we looked towards the Grange for the man who had defied the ghost. He did not come. There was nothing in that, for you could easily allow him a few minutes, although, in truth, half of us had expected him to come rushing out almost as soon as he entered. But he didn't. Neither did he come at a appointed time, nor at 10 past 12, nor at a quarter past, nor indeed at half past. In fact, he never returned. We waited and waited, wondering each of us what had happened, and not a man of us brave enough to enter the house in search of him. Still we waited, until at last we saw the moon sinking low and the grey dawn breaking through. When it got a little lighter, we decided to go together into the Grange to see, if possible, what had happened. On entering, our first project was to see if the nail had been knocked in, so we climbed the staircase, near the top of which was situated the door of the bedroom with a large balcony window facing east. There we found poor old Jimmy with the tail of his coat nailed firmly to the door. The hammer was still clutched tightly in his right hand, and he was prostrate as far as his coat being nailed to the door would allow. Poor old Jimmy. No wonder he answered not our calls. No wonder he did not return at the appointed time. He was as dead as the post of the very door to which he was nailed. "Do you think he saw the ghost then?" I ventured. As though wishing to avoid giving an answer, old Joe put on his hat as if to leave the room. "No," he answered eventually. Then I asked curiously what happened. "That," he replied, "will never be known. It was believed that when old Jimmy once entered the house, he was fairly confident because of the drink he had taken, which had, no doubt, endowed him with a good deal of Dutch courage. He probably kept his spirits long enough to climb the stairs, and then in the dark he nailed his coat to the door. Then as he turned to retreat, he felt himself held back, when he was seized with the imagination that he was being held back by the ghost, his nerves by this time being so highly strung that he died of fright. As old Joe arrived at this peroration, without another word he left the tap-room in such a manner as would lead one to believe he was anything but loquacious. The Thursday, 23rd of December 1943 edition of the Yorkshire Post had the following story entitled Christmas Ghost Story. Ghost stories are in season. Here is one from East Keswick, and the setting is an old stone house which is the home of a Major Walter Morris, who recently left his work as Regional Savings Commissioner for Yorkshire to take a more important post in the savings world in London. The house dates back over 100 years, and at intervals during the year the imprints of tiny hands appear on the windows. The impressions are perfect, even to fingernails. In the upstairs rooms the imprints are much larger. Interest in these ghostly manifestations has spread beyond the Morris family, and visitors who profess an expert knowledge of such happenings have made an inspection. An ingenious theory is advanced by one expert, whose opinion is that the glass in the windows is very old and dates back to the time when child labour was used in the glass industry. At a certain time, when the glass was cooling, it became photographic and caught the hand impressions of the workers. Polishing and cleaning make no difference. When the windows are sun-warmed, the impressions reappear. These are not the only manifestations the Morris family have become aware of in their Yorkshire home. It is haunted by the ghost of a little moppy-coated dog who runs up the main staircase and comes to a standstill at the door of a room leading off a corridor. Investigation has proved that a previous owner who died over 40 years ago had a little dog of this description, which was devoted to him. The dog died shortly after its master's death. The Saturday, 29th of December 1906 edition of the Somerset Guardian has the following story, again entitled Christmas Ghost Story. The inhabitants of Dronfield, a Derbyshire village a few miles from Sheffield, have been thrown into a state of excitement by the reported appearance of a ghost. A young married couple from Sheffield went to occupy the house, and one night they had some Sheffield children staying with them. Owing to this, the wife slept with the children upstairs, and the husband slept on the sofa downstairs. In the middle of the night, footsteps were heard by both husband and wife, but as each thought it was the other moving, neither got out of bed. This occurrence was followed by mysterious knockings coming from a corner of the room over the cellar. The fear of the young couple was now so great that they never slept without a light in the bedroom. The climax came when, in the middle of the night, the wife woke up and found that the light was out. She struck a match, then she saw in the corner of the room, she declares, a figure of a skeleton, which, as the flame of the match died away, moved slowly towards the door. The husband, who was hastily aroused, lit the gas, but the apparition had vanished and was seen no more. The house is now to let. To finish this Christmas edition of the podcast, let's talk festive food. In particular, Christmas cake. Christmas cake is a rich fruit cake with massive variations in baking method and ingredients on a country and county by county basis. In England, a lot of Christmas cake bought from a shop will be a heavy fruit cake with a layer of marzipan, then royal icing over the top. The price can be somewhat royal as well. I was at a Christmas fair and farmers market last weekend and saw slabs of Christmas cake selling at £30 each. Translating size for size against the one I've baked, I could possibly sell it for over £100, if I was so inclined, which I'm not. The origin of Christmas cake, as with many such things, is shrouded in history, or should that be shrouded in mystery, with a number of theories popping up with Christmas cake origin stories. Most sources seem to put the origins of the English Christmas cake in the 16th century, when it was originally baked at Easter as an Easter cake, essentially with leftover ingredients from Christmas puddings. The puddings themselves appear to be first mentioned in medieval England. However, the cake was so popular it began to be baked at Christmas alongside the traditional puddings. Some food historians claim that the spices used in the traditional cake were to symbolise the gifts provided to the baby Jesus by the three wise men. But delving into this a little more, I think this is a modern supposition, though as usual, if anyone wants to correct me on this, they're more than welcome to do so. Some also claim that the origin of the modern iced and marzipan cake lies in the Twelfth Night cake, traditionally eaten on the 5th of January, where a bean or pea was also cooked in with the cake, and whoever found it became king or queen of the Twelfth Night party. However, this doesn't seem to be the case, with the Twelfth Night cake being a separate entity. On a side note, apparently in the early 17th century, Oliver Cromwell banned feasting on Twelfth Night, simply complaining that it was just too much excess by that point in the Christmas festivities. Now in the 18th century, a Yorkshire lass called Elizabeth Raffald was a household name, most famous for her book entitled The Experienced English Housekeeper, published in 1769. As well as potentially being the inventor of the Eccles cake, it is now thought she was the first to pair a Christmas fruitcake recipe with the topping of marzipan and icing, though in her book it was noted to be a wedding cake, or bride cake as she called it. For many people, Christmas cake baking comes with its own traditions, with recipes passed from generation to generation. Until a few years ago, my mum always baked one for me, alongside one for my dad and her, But as tradition goes, the last couple of years I've been making my own, supervised of course by my mum, though my use of modern food mixer instead of a ceramic bowl and wooden spoon still raises an eyebrow. I do use the same recipe she's taught me, though I do vary the added extras. Last year I put dried citrus peel into the mix. This year I've put Morello glacé cherries in. I also use a nice rum spice with ginger and vanilla rather than traditional brandy. And also, heavily against tradition, while I still use marzipan, I don't use icing anymore, instead melting and mixing darkened milk chocolate and spreading that over the cake as a seal. This just comes down to personal preference of myself and my daughter, as these days the traditional icing can be just a little bit too sweet for me. So why not at this point take the blue sky and have a look at the images I've posted of the cake, and let me know your own ideas and recipes, and of course put a picture of your cake on there. Well, thanks for listening to this festive edition of Within the Boggart Wood. I hope everyone has a very Merry Christmas, and see you all in the new year.